Welcome to Chapter 24. In this chapter we're going to be looking at the origin of species. And we're going to start this section by talking about Darwin's exploration of the Galapagos Islands. Now, one thing that Darwin realized about the Galapagos is that they're volcanically formed, which meant that they weren't always there, and they slowly formed over the course of repeated volcanic eruptions. The Hawaiian Islands are forming in the exact same fashion that the Galapagos did. What struck Darwin as odd is how much life existed on these islands. And we have to consider that in terms of the planet, these islands were really young, and so are the life forms. The life forms aren't found anywhere else in the world except for on the Galapagos Islands. So this kind of brought about the idea of the mystery of mysteries, and more along the lines of how did these species get to be here? Why aren't they found anywhere else? How is this happening? So we discovered a lot of plants, a lot of animals. They're found nowhere else on our planet. Now the process of how all of those species on the Galapagos Islands came to be occurred through a process called speciation, which is the formation of a new species. And this is now the focal point of the evolutionary theory. It explains how living things change over the course of time through a process called divergent evolution. Now, looking at the evolutionary theory, we have to be able to use this process of speciation to explain how new populations evolve and how new populations come to be. So that's where we're looking at down here when it says microevolution drives macroevolution. Microevolution would be something that's occurring within one species or a population. This is where we were talking about with the Hardy-Weinberg, where we see certain allele frequencies change a little bit, and if it's changing, then the population is evolving or the species is evolving. Macroevolution, on the other hand, this is when we're talking about really the formation of a new species. One species is changing so drastically that's becoming a different species. And we talked a little bit previously about the disruptive selection and how that could result in the formation of new species. That's sort of what we're looking at more along the lines with macroevolution, is the process of speciation, the formation of new species. So looking here, we see two different formats that speciation can occur. The one is called anagenesis. This is where one species encounters significant allele frequency shifts, resulting in a change to that species becoming a different one. So in this particular scenario, this is the ancestral species of this current modernized species. So one species changes in and of itself into an entirely different species. Cladogenesis shows a bit more of a divergence in regards to evolution. We have one population, one species, that's getting separated into two different species. And what would cause this divergence to occur? Most likely significant changes in the gene pool and isolation of two gene pools. So in other words, there's possibly a geographic barrier that's separating two species of birds. And by geographic barrier, I'm talking like a huge mountain range or an ocean that these birds can't physically hang out with this population, and this population can't hang out with those ones. There's some kind of isolating mechanism there, preventing the gene flow from one population to the next or vice versa. So we just mentioned a form of isolation. We're going to be looking at reproductive isolation here within species that keeps species separate from one another. So let's start with species. What a species is, well, it comes from Latin for meaning kind or appearance. We're talking about individuals of the same kind or individuals of the same appearance. That's the topical view of a species. But keep in mind what we talked about species previously, and that's where we're talking about one population or group whose members are able to interbreed, they can have a child, and that child is viable, meaning that it is capable of staying alive and living healthy itself, and while being able to stay healthy and live itself, it can produce fertile offspring. And this is how we were able to differentiate between the donkeys and the horses as being two different species. They could produce a viable offspring, a mule. That mule could survive just fine, but it couldn't produce offspring itself because it was not fertile. There's going to be some examples coming up where we illustrate how sometimes two species can interbreed with one another, but their offspring are not viable at all. They have a very, very rough time and struggle to survive. So looking at this image right here, in the classification of what is a species, these two birds look quite similar, and frankly, if they tried to interbreed with one another, they probably could produce some offspring. But they're not attracted to one another due to differences in their courtships. Now think about when we were first starting off that Hardy-Weinberg activity that we did in class, and I showed you that brief video over the courting rituals of some of the birds. You know, you have the sometimes the display of color, sometimes the chirp. Well, the chirp is actually the isolating mechanism between these two species. The one species has a chirp to attract mates. Well, that chirp is not attractive to the other species. Therefore, they are said to be isolated from one another in regards to their courtship rituals. While they very possibly inhabit the same area, they don't naturally interbreed because of that isolation within the bird chirp. Humans, now we have a bunch of different races of humans and a bunch of different cultural backgrounds, but we're all the same species because we can and do select to breed with members of different races, and we produce viable and fertile offspring. So by definition, we are all the same species, whereas these two birds are separated. Now that example we just looked at with the birds and their chirps, that would be just one example of a reproductive isolating mechanism. A reproductive isolating mechanism is anything that could prevent two organisms from mating or courting one another because they're not attracted to one another's I guess rituals. Now in the case of those birds, that was the chirp. But there's other things that can cause reproductive isolation as well. And we're going to look at some of those things coming up. So some of those reproductive mechanisms can either be pre or post zygotic barriers. Pre-zygotic, these would impede mating between species or hinder the fertilization of ova if members of different species attempted to mate. So this would be before fertilization, pre-zygotic. Post-zygotic would be after fertilization had occurred. So let's check that one. Often prevent the hybrid zygote, a little bit of both species, from developing into a viable fertile adult. Once again, viable meaning healthy, and fertile adult can produce children. So looking at some of those barriers here within reproductive isolation, looking at the line on the top, that is one species in blue and a different species in yellow. And when we see, this arrow going down and this arrow going up, we're talking about an attempt at mating and the incompatibility of it because of these isolating mechanisms. The first that we have on our list is habitat isolation. Now they might be in the same community, living in the same area, but they might not really be able to cross paths because of differences in where they live. And we see that going on with these two species of snakes right here. One lives on land, one lives on water, So they're isolated from one another due to where they live. The next one would be temporal isolation. And temporal isolation is where two different species could mate, they could reproduce together, but they don't because of timing, more or less. The example that we're looking at down below is two pictures of two different skunks, two different species of skunks, but the one up on top reproduces and mates in the winter, and this one chooses to reproduce and mate during the spring. For whatever reason, these skunks select when to mate because in their particular existence, that must provide some kind of advantage that has helped them along the way. And this is kind of pre-programmed with a lot of species. You see salmon doing that every year in the spring, where they swim upriver, mate, reproduce, lay eggs, and then die. You see that going on right now here with all the chirping birds. They're looking for mates. This is the time of year when they reproduce. However, some species might reproduce at different times of the year, and although they could probably produce for the offspring, they don't because of their timing. That's temporal isolation. The next is behavioral isolation, where species are attracted only to the behaviors characteristic of their own kind. And the bird chirping would be an example of behavioral isolation. Here we see two birds. These are blue-footed boobies. The males, they attract the females by kind of doing this high-stepping thing to show off their blue feet, which is kind of their courtship ritual within this particular species. This allows the female to recognize the blue feet as being one of her own kind and enhances the opportunity for mating and breeding. And these are all pre-zygotic because they occur before zygotes have formed. And the last one that we can see on this slide, still pre-zygotic, is mechanical isolation. And what mechanical isolation is implying is that the anatomies of the two different organisms are so different that reproduction or the attempt at it isn't even really possible, so to speak. And it almost seems like it could be getting to be this way within the species of dogs. You know, you got some of the huge breeds of dogs and some of the really tiny breeds of dogs. Mating doesn't really, it's just not really possible. And that would be a mechanical isolation where the act of reproduction just can't exist. So they're isolated mechanically. We're going to be looking at another slide with one more pre-zygotic and then a few post-zygotics, but we're going to pick up on that one in the next video here. I would like to point out that all of these examples are on page 490 and 491 of the book if you're looking for a little bit more text to fill in your information with. I know I'm doing a lot of talking here and showing you pictures, but you kind of have to keep up with my speech in order to follow along with your notes. So 490, 491 if you're looking for more concrete written verbiage.